back to Colorado, and I drove them to the small town that I grew up in as a young boy. It was there that I was attempting to impart to them a piece of their history. I wanted to take my wife and my two boys back to the town that I grew up in and to use the town as a backdrop to maybe somehow impart to them some of their history. I wanted to give them a glimpse and a taste of some of what has led our family to where it is today. And so we began the journey that day driving around the small town, and we drove by the different schools that I attended as a very young boy, and we drove by the different houses that we lived in and the houses that formerly belonged to certain family members. And I did my best to pull from my very young childhood memories all of the details that I could muster up, and I did the best that I could to somehow weave together a story about our family and where they came from and some of the things that brought us. We went by my grandmother and my grandfather's old house, and we drove by the little church building that my grandfather used to be a pastor of, and I was doing my best to tell them stories from my childhood. And as part of the journey that day, we found ourselves making our way through the local cemetery of that small town. I could not remember exactly where certain family members were at, and so as we began to make our way through the cemetery looking for those gravestones and those markers, I noticed that when I looked down at those gravestones, it came to my mind that represented there that day in that place were many stories. There were many lives represented there. As I was trying to tell my own story to my children, I looked down and noticed that on every one of those gravestones there was a date that marked the beginning of every one of the stories represented there. And then there was a date that marked the end of their story, the very ending of their story. And then, of course, in between those two dates was a little dash that represented the storyline. And I began to let my mind wander about the different names that I saw there that day. I wondered what was their story. I could tell the story of my grandparents, and then when we found their gravestone, I began to recollect some of the fond and precious memories, and I could give a little bit of my story to my children that day. But what about all of the rest of the stories represented in that graveyard that day? What kind of stories were laying there in neat rows across the manicured lawn of that cemetery that day? I began to ponder because as a younger man, for a brief time in between jobs, I worked for just a little while at a funeral home. And there at that funeral home, on pretty much a daily basis, I was introduced to the end of people's stories. Every day I sat with family members who would begin to talk, and as I would listen, I could piece together parts of the puzzle concerning their life. And listening to the memorial services, I could sometimes put two and two together, and there were some stories that came to an ending because of things like sickness and natural causes of death. But there were other people there that they met an untimely ending. Some of them because of particular life choices that they made, Pastor Burton. Some of them because of particular roads that they traveled. Their life came to an abrupt ending. And I got to see see firsthand the end of their story. This is what led them to this place. This is what brought them here. Some of them, the stories were sad tales that involved other people in their lives that brought them to a tragic ending. I know that we don't know much about it today, but when I was a young boy, there were some certain books that became very popular with my age group as a young man. They were called Choose Your Own Adventure books. Does anybody remember those books? The old Choose Your Own Adventure books. They became popular because the way that they were written is that you would open up the book and begin to read. And as the story would unfold, somewhere along the way, the author would bring the reader into the driver's seat of the story. And you would be placed there in first person as a participant of the story. And at some point in the story, the author would give you the choice of making a particular decision. And if you made decision A, then you would turn to a certain page in the book and the story would continue.